The trade war did not break in a press conference. It did not break with a dramatic speech. It did not break with a shouted accusation on the Senate floor. It broke in silence. According to the account now circulating in Washington, the moment came on a Thursday evening, deep inside the Russell Senate office building, when 17 Republican senators walked out of a closed-door meeting and said absolutely nothing. No smiles, no rehearsed lines, no, we remain united. No, the president has our full confidence. Nothing. And sometimes in politics, silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the sound of a strategy collapsing. For nearly 2 years, the White House had operated on one assumption: that Republican senators would absorb the economic pain of the trade war, defend the policy in public, and keep their objections behind closed doors. That assumption had survived tariffs, retaliation, angry farmers, pressure from manufacturers, nervous markets, and warnings from business groups. But then came the one number that changes everything in American politics. Not GDP, not inflation, not the trade deficit. The number of months left before an election. And once that number became smaller, every other number suddenly became impossible to ignore. The reported figures were brutal. Millions of jobs at risk or already displaced. Dozens of states feeling the pressure. Farmers losing export markets. Manufacturers facing rising costs. And local economies beginning to crack under a policy that was supposed to produce leverage abroad, but was now producing damage at home. That is the hidden danger of a trade war. At the beginning, it looks like a weapon. A government announces tariffs. It promises strength. It promises pressure. It promises that the other side will eventually surrender. But over time, the weapon starts changing direction. The tariff that was supposed to hurt a foreign producer starts raising costs for a domestic factory. The retaliation that was supposed to be temporary starts closing export markets for farmers. The political message that once sounded strong in national speeches starts sounding very different in small towns, plant tours, local chambers of commerce, and farm bureau meetings. And that is where this story becomes much bigger than tariffs, because the most important event in this account was not a Canadian announcement. It was not a market reaction. It was not even the public statements that came later. The most important event was a vote count. Behind that closed door, the senators were not debating theory. They were not arguing ideology. They were doing arithmetic. How many votes were needed to limit the president's tariff authority? How many Republicans were willing to break? How many Democrats would join? And most importantly, could the Senate reach a veto-proof majority? That is the moment a president should fear most. Not when his opponents attack him, not when foreign leaders criticize him, not when markets move against him. A president should worry when his own party stops defending the strategy and starts counting votes against it. Because once the conversation moves from loyalty to arithmetic, the emotional phase is over. The political survival phase has begun. In the account, the senators entered the room with one number and left with another. They reportedly walked in believing they had a narrow coalition. They walked out believing they had the votes. That changed everything. Until that moment, the White House could still believe that complaints from business groups were manageable. It could still believe that local anger would fade. It could still believe that senators would complain privately but obey publicly. But a veto-proof majority is not a complaint. It is not frustration. It is not mood. It is power. And once that number existed, even privately, the entire trade strategy entered a new phase. This is why the silence in the hallway mattered. A senator does not need to give a dramatic quote when the vote count already says everything. A senator does not need to attack the president on camera when the procedure itself is the attack. A senator does not need to announce rebellion when the machinery of rebellion has already started moving. Then came the sentence from Ottawa. Mark Carney, speaking from a podium, delivered the line that gave the moment its political shape. The damage is no longer ours alone to absorb. 11 words. But those 11 words worked because they did two things at the same time. On the surface, they described an economic fact. The cost of the confrontation had crossed the border. It was no longer only Canada absorbing pressure, uncertainty, and disruption. The pressure had moved into American states, American industries, American companies, and American households. But beneath the surface, the sentence delivered a much sharper message. It said, the strategy has inverted. The original plan was simple: create enough pressure on Canada that Canada eventually gives in. But after months of resistance, the pressure did not produce capitulation. It produced something else. It produced political pain inside the United States. And in a democracy, political pain is not just a side effect. It is the battlefield. That is the central lesson of this entire story. Trade wars are not won only in ports, factories, customs offices, or negotiation rooms. They are won or lost in domestic politics. A government can tolerate bad headlines for a while. It can tolerate angry editorials. It can tolerate criticism from the opposition. But it cannot indefinitely tolerate its own voters paying the price, its own companies warning of damage, its own senators fearing defeat, and its own party quietly preparing to remove authority from the president's hands. That is not foreign pressure anymore. That is internal collapse. And this is where the reported reaction from Warren Buffett becomes powerful, whether one treats it as literal or as a strategic interpretation of the moment. The logic is simple. Every prolonged confrontation depends on time. The side that starts the confrontation usually believes time is its ally. It believes the opponent will weaken first. It believes pain will accumulate faster on the other side. It believes the domestic cost will remain manageable. But time is never neutral. Time tests both sides. Time exposes weak assumptions. Time turns temporary losses into permanent anger. Time turns business warnings into investment decisions. Time turns frustrated voters into polling data. And polling data turns into terrified senators. This is why endurance matters. Canada did not need to defeat the United States in a traditional sense. It only needed to survive long enough for the American political system to start processing the cost. And once American politicians began to see that cost not as an abstract trade number, but as an election problem, the conflict changed. Because elected officials do not respond to pain in the same way governments do. A government can speak in strategy. A president can speak in leverage. A trade representative can speak in long-term restructuring. But a senator facing re-election speaks in counties, industries, donors, local employers, and voters who remember what happened to their income. That is why the farm states matter. That is why the manufacturing states matter. That is why Michigan, Ohio, Iowa, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and North Carolina matter in a story like this. They are not just states on a map. They are pressure points. When farmers lose export markets, that is not only an economic issue, it becomes a political identity issue. When factories face higher input costs, that is not only a balance sheet problem, it becomes a jobs problem. When businesses stop planning beyond the next quarter because trade policy is unstable, that is not only corporate caution, it becomes a growth problem. And when all of that happens in states that decide Senate races, the policy is no longer protected by ideology. It is exposed to survival. That is why the reported basement meeting matters more than any public speech. Public speeches are designed for audiences. Private meetings are designed for decisions. In public, politicians can still defend a policy. They can still use strong language. They can still say the pain is temporary. They can still say victory is coming. But in private, they ask a different question. Can I survive this? And once enough senators answer no, the strategy is already broken. The market reaction in the account also makes sense from a strategic perspective. Markets do not always respond to whether a policy is good or bad morally. They respond to uncertainty, risk, and expected future conditions. If investors believe the Senate may limit further tariff escalation, then companies exposed to trade suddenly look less dangerous. Manufacturers can plan. Agricultural exporters can hope for stabilization. Supply chains can begin pricing in a future that is not defined by constant escalation. That is why even the possibility of legislative restraint can move markets, because markets do not wait for the final vote. They move when probability changes. And the probability changed the moment the senators reportedly had the votes. But the deeper question is not what markets did on Friday. The deeper question is what this means for presidential power. For decades, Congress has often allowed presidents broad freedom in trade and national security decisions. That freedom can be useful in a crisis. It allows speed, it allows pressure, it allows negotiation. But when that power is used too aggressively, Congress eventually remembers that it has its own constitutional role. And that is what makes Section 232 such a sensitive point. If a president can use national security authority to impose broad tariffs, then trade policy can move very quickly. But if the costs become too high, Congress can become the place where that power is challenged. That is the real confrontation underneath the confrontation. It is not only Canada versus the United States. It is not only tariffs versus free trade. It is not only farmers versus factories. It is executive power versus legislative fear. And legislative fear is one of the most powerful forces in Washington. Not moral fear, not philosophical fear, electoral fear, the fear of losing a seat. The fear of explaining an indefensible policy back home. The fear of watching a local economy suffer while still being asked to defend the strategy that contributed to the pain. That kind of fear changes votes. So when Carney says the damage is no longer ours alone to absorb, the line lands because it describes the exact moment when foreign policy returns home. For months, maybe years, the confrontation was framed as pressure on Canada. But now the damage has entered American politics. And once that happens, the question becomes unavoidable. Can a president continue a trade war after his own party decides the political cost is too high? That is the question at the center of this story. Not whether tariffs are always wrong. Not whether Canada is always right. Not whether trade disputes can ever be justified. The question is whether a strategy can survive after the people required to defend it decide they can no longer afford to do so. Because every strategy has two budgets. The first is financial. How much money is lost? How many jobs are affected? How much do prices rise? How much pressure can businesses absorb? The second is political. How many angry voters? How many endangered senators? How many damaged states? How many local economies turning against the policy? A president can sometimes survive the first budget, but very few presidents survive the second, once their own party starts calculating against them. That is why the reported sentence near the elevator is so powerful. We can't keep doing this anymore. Not, we disagree. Not, we need adjustments. Not, we have concerns. We can't keep doing this anymore. That is not policy criticism. That is exhaustion. And exhaustion is dangerous because it means the people defending the strategy have run out of language. They no longer know how to explain it. They no longer believe the promised victory is close enough. They no longer think the next talking point can carry them through the next town hall. At that point, politics becomes very simple. When the math of a trade war and the math of re-election collide, re-election usually wins. So what happens next? If the reported vote count holds, the president faces a choice. He can escalate and risk a public break with his own party. He can negotiate and claim victory before the damage deepens. Or he can attack the senators and turn a trade conflict into an internal party war. None of those options is clean. Escalation looks strong, but it could make the rebellion larger. Negotiation looks practical, but it may look like retreat. Attacking senators may satisfy loyal supporters, but it could turn private dissent into public defiance. That is why this moment matters. Because the real damage may not be only economic anymore. It may be structural. Once senators learn that they can count votes against a president on trade, they may use that power again. Once businesses learn that pressure on Congress works, they may intensify it. Once foreign governments learn that endurance can expose domestic divisions in Washington, they may negotiate differently. That is the future impact. The tariff fight may eventually end. The markets may stabilize. The numbers may improve. But the political lesson will remain. A trade war can be launched from the top, but it is survived from the bottom. And if the bottom breaks first, the top loses control. That is why one quiet hallway, one closed-door meeting, and one sentence from Ottawa could become more important than months of official speeches. Because power does not always collapse loudly. Sometimes it collapses when 17 senators walk past the cameras and say nothing. Sometimes it collapses when a vote count changes in a basement room. Sometimes it collapses when the sentence everyone tried to avoid finally becomes impossible to deny. The damage is no longer ours alone to absorb. And now the question is simple. If the cost of continuing is greater than the cost of stopping, how long can any leader pretend the strategy is still working? Tell me in the comments, is this the beginning of the end of the trade war, or just the beginning of a much bigger political fight? And subscribe for more sharp analysis on the decisions shaping global politics, markets, and power.